Hello, this is International Master Nigel Povar. I took the top group of the junior club last Monday, and once again we covered some endgame positions. We started with the position shown here on the board, which arose from a game between the American Bobby Fischer and the Russian Vasily Smyslov, both of them former world champions. Fischer was playing white, and in this position Fischer played the natural rook to d1, and he's taken control of the only open file on the board, and in this position Smyslov had the choice between moving his king or challenging the white rook with rook to d8. Smyslov, being a strong player in his own right, knew quite correctly that to challenge with rook d8 would have been a huge mistake, as we'll see in a moment, and Smyslov played king e7, and this game eventually ended in a draw. But the interesting thing is, what happens if black plays the natural move, rook to d8, whereby he obviously thinks that he's going to trade the rooks, and that's what would happen, and we reach this king and pawn ending. Now the material balance is level, but the critical feature of this position is that both sides have pawn majorities. White has a pawn majority on the king side, with these 4 white pawns opposed by 3 black pawns, whereas on the queen side, black has a majority of 4 black pawns against white's 3 pawns. But the difference is, on the queen side, both sides have doubled pawns. In white's case, his doubled pawns don't really matter that much. Yes, it would be preferable if this white pawn on c3 were back on b2, but it doesn't really alter the characteristic of this position particularly. What is significant here is that black will find it nigh on impossible to create a majority to create a pass pawn on the queen side, whereas white can actually create a pass pawn on the king side quite readily. And it was just interesting to sort of discuss this with the kids and to check their understanding and to show them how this actually works. So there's a number of moves that white can play here. It's white to play, which would lead to a good position for him. The one that I chose to illustrate, which is probably one of the quickest, is to immediately play f4. Black would more than likely capture. If he doesn't capture, it makes little difference, because white would then capture and he'd have an outside pass pawn. And now the white king comes up, the black king comes up as well, and white regains the pawn. And in this position now, black needs to start doing something on the queen side. There's nothing he can do on the king side. So let's assume that black advances with his b pawn like this, which is quite a natural move, and we reach a very important position. White has a major choice here between 2 moves really, either playing pawn to g4 and trying to get his pawns advancing, or running after the black pawn on h7 by playing king to g4. Well, the correct move is king to g4, and I'm going to show you in a minute how that works. But it's interesting to look at why pawn to g4 doesn't actually work. It's interesting, I did say to the group that I first looked at this position years and years ago, because I wrote an article about it and was demonstrating how this endgame is won for white, and at that time I thought this move was probably the correct way to play. But actually, with the benefit of computer engines nowadays, it's apparent that this move doesn't work, and it's interesting to look at just why it doesn't work. So in this position, black mobilizes, or starts to mobilize, his queenside majority, and once again we reach a very important moment in the position. It's very important now that white plays c4. This prevents black from playing c4, and if white plays this, then this position still offers a lot of promise to the white player, unless black finds the right moves. But let's look for one moment at what would happen if white doesn't play c4, but instead just seeks to try and continue with his advantage on the king side. Black in this position doesn't capture g5, but simply plays c4 himself. And now it's interesting just to see what happens. White would capture here, say, black captures, white can advance, and then the kings reach this position. But now black plays c5, preventing king to d4. And now in this position, the problem for white is that he's got nothing he can do. He can push his h-pawn up, but black will push his h-pawn up and block it if necessary, or can even leave his h-pawn on h7. And all the while, what black is going to be doing is advancing with his queenside pawns. So for example, let's assume white goes king here. Black brings his queenside pawns up and now plays like this. And we reach this position where now this queenside majority is going to become effective. If white captures on b4, black recaptures, and he's got a true and effective majority. But if on the other hand white just plays king back to e4, then black can play b3, and after pawn takes, capture here, and a3, that black pawn is going to queen. So this is a winning variation for black. So all of this illustrates that after this move c5 here, white must prevent black from playing c4 and must himself play c4. And now the right move and the critical move for black, and I must admit, when I ran this session last week, I got my lines confused because I was looking wrongly at my notes, and I played the pawn to b4, the wrong move. An essential move for black now is h6. And this move is important because it prevents white from playing his pawn to g5. And now, if, for example, white continues with h4, then black can now play b4. Black shouldn't capture on c4, by the way, because having a triple pawn on the c-file serves him no good, and it won't enable him to make any progress. In fact, it weakens his position. But now the problem for white is that he can't find an effective break, because, for example, if he plays g5, this is absolutely hopeless. It loses, in fact, captures like so, and after this, totally hopeless for white because the black king will mop up all of the queenside pawns. So instead, let's assume white plays e5 instead of g5, a much better move. Originally, this was the line I thought was going to win for white. So black captures, the king blockades, and white has this pass pawn coming on g5. But unfortunately, after a5, g5, the critical move here to save black is not to capture, which would definitely lose because there will be an outside pawn, but to play h5. And this saves black because it leaves him with his own kingside pawn, which in the end will offer counterplay against the white king's activity. So for example, watch what happens. White now tries to deflect the black king like this. This pawn drops, but after king here, white can move over and gobble pawns, but as you can see, this leads to a position where both sides are going to queen. If you count, you'll see that it takes 6 moves for both sides to queen. That's capturing the pawn, moving the king off the file, and then 4 pawn moves. So 6 moves by each side, both sides queening, and we reach a position with balanced chances. Clearly not what white wants to achieve. So this demonstrates that going back to our original position where we played g4, g4 does not work. Therefore the right move in this position is to play king to g4. And the idea is quite simple. We're not worried about losing the e4 pawn, but we're going to advance our king up to capture the h7 pawn, and then the h2 pawn is going to just advance up the board. So watch what happens. In this position, black, say, plays pawn to c5. He could instead, by the way, play king e5, but then this is what would happen. And after this, you can see that it's not easy for black to do anything, because, for example, if he goes king here to try and prevent the white pawns from advancing, then this would happen, and we get this unfortunate position because the white pawns are going to deflect the black king, the f6 pawn will drop, and then white will get over to the queen side before black can. So if instead of that black plays c5, as I said just now, white can play king to h5 and go for the h pawn, In this position, black tries to get his queenside majority going, but after king here, and now f5, the pawns are traded, and now in this position, the white king doesn't, in this position white doesn't advance his h-pawn, but the white king comes back, and this effectively allows white to get his pawns, his pass pawn going on the king side. So after this, white plays check, and we can see that this results in a one position for white, because after this, white is 2 pawns up in a queen and pawn ending. So it's quite a long and complicated line, but it's very interesting, and it illustrates how this type of position is won for white. When I say this type of position, I'm referring to the position that arose after the capture of the rooks, going back here, where we have this majority on both sides of the board, but white has an effective pass pawn majority on the king side, whilst black on the queen side has an ineffective pawn majority. So I think there's an interesting sort of lesson there for the junior players to realise that they have to look carefully at which pieces to exchange when considering entering into king and pawn endgames. And we're now going to move on to another king and pawn endgame with another interesting feature, and we'll look at that next. This second king and pawn endgame is a rather interesting position with, again, some interesting lessons for the junior players to take on board. The board, you could say, is split in half, and you've got what's happening on the queen side and what's happening on the king side. First of all, if we look to the queen side, we see an interesting setup where there's 2 white pawns on a6 and c6, the black king on b8. And what we have here is what in effect is a mutual Zugzwang, or mutual paralysis. Whichever side moves first on that side of the board loses. If the black king were to move, one of those white pawns will promote, and he can't be prevented. If the white pawns were to move, whichever one advances is captured, and then the other one is captured shortly afterwards. So we have this sort of mutual Zugzwang on that side of the board, which then means if we look at what's happening on the king side of the board, we have a simple situation where there's a white king on g1 opposed by 3 connected pass pawns on a7, on h7, g7 and f7. And the issue arises now, the question arises, well, who's better here? Can a white king on its own actually prevent 3 black pawns from advancing and one of them getting to become a queen? Or will the 3 black pawns overwhelm the lone king? So I asked the kids what they thought, and it was interesting. The majority of them thought that the 3 pawns would win. And I actually pointed out to them that actually that's not the case. With correct play, the white king will overwhelm these 3 pawns. But the key is with correct play. And that means one has to find the right moves at the critical moments. So it's interesting just to look at 1 or 2 lines to see quite how white goes about winning this. Obviously white starts, it is white to play, by advancing his king, and that's a pretty obvious move to play. And now black can respond in a number of different ways, a number of different moves. Let's start with perhaps the most obvious, just advancing one of the pawns 2 squares. Up comes the black king, and generally speaking you head towards the pawn that's advanced the furthest. And now let's say black brings up another pawn, like so. We would move to the side, and let's say again that black brings up another pawn, so all 3 pawns are now abreast on the 4th rank, and this gives white the chance to play the key winning move, and the winning move is king here. And this is the position that I told the juniors they need to remember. You want this position where the 3 black pawns are side by side, as they are here, with the white king with 2 ranks, the white king's on the central file, on the G file, with them in 2 ranks between the 3 pawns and the king. And in this position you want it to be black to move. The simple fact of the matter is, whichever pawn now moves, the white king immediately steps in front of it, and on the next move black has to compromise his position further. We'll come back to this exact position in a moment, and I'll illustrate exactly how that works. But let's go back first of all to this position where the white king is here and black played g5. Let's assume black plays h5 instead. Well, again, we put our king back, and this time we could have gone to f2, but let's say we've gone here. Let's say black goes f4 now. We go king f3, black goes here. We drop the king back, and here we go here. We're waiting, and now again we get this critical idea of the king stepping backwards on this central file, and there are two ranks between the king and the pawns. And now we can illustrate the winning technique. If the pawn comes forward to h3, we go here. Now clearly, if the pawn were to move forward to g3, we would take the h3 pawn. So let's assume he goes f3. Now we go in here. Now if he comes here, we can take. And now if he goes h2, we go here. He comes to g3, and now obviously we go here, and now black must play g2, lose that pawn. h2 will then drop, and clearly the position will be one for white. So let's go back to the original position with the king on g2. Let's now look at, say, black playing h5 instead. Well, it makes little difference. King here, g5, king h2, say, h4, king h3, f5, king h2, f4, king g2, g4, king g1. So if we return to the original position, we can see how these lines illustrate that a lone king, the white king that is, can actually overwhelm three connected pass pawns, assuming they have no support from their king or any other piece. And this position is totally won for white, because we've got a state of mutual paralysis over on the queen side, and the three black pawns will eventually fall to the white king if white plays correctly. So I hope that the juniors learnt some useful tips from this and got to see the power of the king in the endgame.